Hey, everybody. Welcome to another deep dive. You know, you guys love it when we talk about leadership. And this time we're going to look at it when things get really tough. You sent over this blog post called Leadership in Crisis, Lessons from Nehemiah and Moses, Small Steps,
Right.
ND Lama, posted on December 8th of this year, 2024. It's really cool how it uses these two big figures from the Bible, Nehemiah and Moses, and their totally different ways of dealing with challenges. It gives, like a guide to leadership. What really jumps out at me right away is this contrast. The post sets up between Nehemiah, who somehow manages to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem against all these crazy odds,
hmm
and Moses, the guy who parted the Red Sea. Even he messes up big time when the Israelites start complaining.
It is wild how even these legendary guys, right, they're not immune to the pressure of leadership, but yeah, you're spot on. The difference between them and Nehemiah, it's pretty stark. It's almost like a lesson in what to do and what not to do when you're in charge during tough times.
That's exactly. Okay, so let's start with Nehemiah. He finds out about the wall in Jerusalem being broken. And his first instinct isn't to, call a contractor or something. It's to pray and fast. Like he's looking for guidance before he does anything.
Wow.
Talk about a solid foundation. But here's what I find really interesting. The blog points out how Nehemiah prayed. He didn't just throw up a generic help me prayer. He went into detail, confessing the sins that his people had committed, acknowledging how faithful God had been, and then specifically asking for favor with the king. It's like he had a blueprint for praying strategically during a leadership crisis.
That's such a good observation. It wasn't just him vaguely crying out for help. It was focused, strategic. And it directly connected his spiritual leadership with the practical challenge that he had in front of him. And then, like you said, he doesn't just rush off all fired up. He goes to the king, explains the situation, asks for permission and for resources. I mean, that shows some serious foresight.
Right.
Think about it. He's acknowledging the king's authority, showing that he's committed to working within the system. That's so crucial for anyone trying to make a change, especially when people are pushing back against you.
It's like he's playing 4D chess,
I know.
thinking way ahead.
Yeah.
But even with all that prep work, he still runs into these massive roadblocks.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Sanballat and Tobiah, these guys are constantly trying to trip him up, spreading rumors, even threatening him with violence. But Nehemiah, he just keeps his eyes on the goal. What I find super interesting is how the blog post connects his perseverance with the way he inspired the people. He wasn't just barking orders. He was reminding them why they were rebuilding this wall. He connected their work to their history, their faith, their future as a community. It's like he was tapping into this deep well of motivation, something beyond just bricks and mortar.
Yeah, that's a core part of what they call transformational leadership, right? It's not just about managing tasks. It's about inspiring people to share a vision. You see it in so many successful leaders throughout history, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, even someone like Steve Jobs. They all had this knack for connecting with people on an emotional level and getting them to buy into something bigger than themselves.
So it's not just about prayer planning and persistence as separate things. It's about how they all work together.
Oh.
And this brings us to Moses. Here's this guy who literally split the sea in two.
Mm-hmm.
But even he wasn't perfect. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah.
What I find interesting is that the blog post digs into the context of the mistake he made. The Israelites are out in the desert. They're thirsty. They're griping. I mean, come on. You're leading a ton of people through brutal conditions. Can you blame them?
Yeah.
But Moses, instead of doing what God told him, to speak to the rock to get water, he hits it out of frustration. It's like one moment of anger, and bam,
Yeah.
huge consequences.
The thing is, the post doesn't just condemn Moses. It looks at the emotional pressure he was under. Leading people for 40 years through the wilderness, constantly dealing with complaining and doubt, that's got to wear you down. The way the post puts it, Moses' reaction. It's almost a warning about burnout and emotional exhaustion in leadership.
So it's not just about being a good leader in general. It's about remembering the human side of it.
Yeah.
Even the best of us can break under pressure. And this is where the blog post gets really practical. It asks, how can we learn from both these examples? The success of Nehemiah and the stumble of Moses.
It's all about finding a leadership style that uses both strategic thinking and emotional intelligence. The post kind of suggests that maybe if Moses had borrowed a page from Nehemiah's playbook, paused, prayed, thought things through a bit more strategically, maybe things would have turned out differently. It's a powerful thought, isn't it?
It really makes you think about how often our own decisions as leaders are affected by our feelings, whether we realize it or not. I think this is a good spot to take a break and come back in part 2. Because I'm betting our listeners are already thinking about times when they were more like Moses than Nehemiah. Am I right?
Absolutely. And in part 2, we'll dig into some practical ways to cultivate that Nehemiah-style leadership even when things get tough. So stay tuned.
Welcome back. We've been breaking down this idea of leading when a crisis hits. Using Nehemiah and Moses as our examples from that Leadership in Crisis blog post, we left off talking about how even a super experienced leader, someone like Moses, can mess up when their emotions get the better of them.
You got it. And it's tempting to think, well, I'd never do that. But the post makes a really good point. It's not about judging Moses. It's about seeing that we all have those weak moments. So how do we build up our leadership skills, so we can handle those moments better?
Okay, so let's go back to those qualities we've been talking about. Prayer, strategic planning, perseverance, and emotional control. They sound all nice and neat. But how do they actually work in the real world? I mean, if you're in the middle of some crazy situation, you can't just snap your fingers and become a master of your emotions, right?
Exactly. It's something you got to practice. The post suggests using Nehemiah's approach like a template. Remember how his prayer wasn't just a general, help me kind of thing. It was focused, specific, and tied directly to the problems he was facing. So when we're feeling that pressure, that's our cue to stop for a second and ask ourselves, what specific guidance do I need right now? What am I feeling and why?
So it's like taking that prayer blueprint and making it work for us. I can see how that could be helpful. But I'm curious about the planning part. It's not like Nehemiah could have made some detailed project plan for rebuilding a wall way back then.
Right, but he did think ahead. He got the king on board, got resources, figured out potential problems. It's like he understood that good leadership isn't about reacting to every little thing that pops up. It's about having a vision, a plan, and being able to adjust when things inevitably go off track. It's about being proactive, not just putting out fires all the time.
So if we try to apply that to our own lives, it's about thinking, what's my wall? What's the big goal I'm trying to reach? And what steps do I need to take to get there, even when things get messy? But even with the best plans, we all hit setbacks. That's where perseverance kicks in, right? Nehemiah didn't just quit when those guys started messing with him. He adapted, came up with strategies, kept moving forward. How do we develop that kind of grit?
The blog post highlights how Nehemiah inspired people. He kept reminding them why this wall was so important. And that's a powerful lesson for any leader. When things get rough, remind yourself and your team why you're doing this. What's the bigger picture? Connecting to that deeper purpose can give you the fuel to keep going.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But I think for me, and probably for a lot of our listeners, the whole emotional control thing is the hardest part. I mean, we saw what happened to Moses. One moment of frustration, and he makes a decision with consequences that lasted a lifetime. How do we avoid those emotional traps, especially when we're stressed out?
That's where knowing yourself comes in. The post doesn't give us some magic formula to get rid of emotions, because that's not realistic. We're all human. But it does say we should pay attention to our triggers. Those situations or people that tend to push our buttons, when we recognize those triggers, we can start coming up with strategies to deal with them.
So it's like realizing, okay, this is a situation where I usually get really frustrated, so what can I do to stay calm? Maybe it's taking a few deep breaths. Maybe it's stepping away for a few minutes. Maybe it's having a trusted person I can talk to.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for you. And the post brings up another important point. Our emotions as leaders, they can be contagious. If we're giving off stress and anxiety, our team will pick up on that and it'll bounce right back at us.
So keeping our own emotions in check isn't just about us feeling good. It's about setting the right tone for the whole team. But I'm realizing we've been talking about these qualities mostly in the context of a crisis. Aren't they just as important for everyday leadership, even when things are pretty calm?
That's a great observation. And I think the blog post would agree. These aren't just tools for crisis management. They're fundamental to being an effective leader all the time. Think about it. Whether you're starting a new project, trying to work out a tough deal, or even just making a difficult decision, prayer planning, perseverance, and emotional control can help you lead with more wisdom, clarity, and impact. They're almost like a compass for leadership, guiding us towards making smarter choices, building stronger relationships, and ultimately achieving more success.
So it's not just about weathering the storm. It's about leading, well, no matter the weather. This has been so insightful, but I think we need to pause again. There's still a lot to unpack. In part 3, maybe we can look at how to actually put these principles into practice to really make them part of how we lead. Because it's one thing to understand them in our heads, but how do we actually live them? That's the real challenge, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And I think the blog post gives us some valuable hints for that journey. Stay tuned.
Welcome back for the last part of our deep dive into leading during a crisis. We've been using this blog post, Leadership in Crisis, to see how Nehemiah and Moses handled some pretty intense situations. And we've been talking about those important qualities like prayer planning, perseverance, and emotional control. Not just as tools for a crisis, but as the foundation for good leadership in any situation. But now comes the tricky part. How do we actually make these qualities part of our own leadership style? It's easy to talk about them, but actually living them out is a whole different story.
You hit the nail on the head. It's like the difference between reading a cookbook and actually cooking something. The real learning happens when we put those principles into practice. And the blog post kind of hints at this. It suggests that maybe what tripped up Moses wasn't just that he lost control of his emotions, but that he lost touch with that deeper why that Nehemiah had.
That's an interesting thought. So it's like Moses was so caught up in the everyday stuff of leading that he forgot about the bigger picture. And maybe that disconnect made him more likely to react without thinking when things got tough.
Exactly. It's like he was on autopilot instead of being really present and intentional in his leadership. And the blog post challenges us to ask, what's our why? What are those core values that drive our leadership? When we're clear about those values, we can start making decisions that line up with them, even under pressure.
So it's like having this internal compass that helps us navigate those difficult situations. But I'm curious, how does that work in real life? I mean, if I'm in the middle of a crisis, I'm not going to have time to sit down and write out my whole life mission statement.
Right, but it's about having those values so ingrained in us that they just become a natural part of how we lead. And the post suggests one way to do this is through regular reflection. Taking time to think about our experiences, the good and the bad, and asking, what did I learn from this? How can I be better next time? Am I living up to my own values?
It's like building muscle memory, but for leadership. The more we practice mashing our actions to our values, the more it becomes second nature. And that can help us stay grounded and make better choices even when things are crazy.
You got it. And this brings us back to the idea of prayer. The post doesn't tell us to do any specific religious practice, but it emphasizes how important it is to seek guidance, whether that's through prayer meditation or just taking some quiet time to think. It's about admitting that we don't know everything and being open to finding wisdom from somewhere beyond ourselves.
So it's not about having some magic formula, but about developing humility and a willingness to learn. And I think that connects really well with the concept of perseverance, because when we know our why and we're dedicated to living it out, we're more likely to keep going even when things are hard. We're not just working for a paycheck or a promotion. We're working towards something bigger than ourselves.
And that sense of purpose can be really powerful, especially in a crisis. It can fuel our determination, inspire the people around us, and help us stay on track even when the path gets rocky.
It's like Nehemiah getting everyone excited to rebuild that wall. He didn't just boss them around. He reminded them why it was so important. And that shared sense of purpose gave them the strength to keep going, even with all the obstacles.
Exactly. And that brings us to emotional control. The post doesn't say we should suppress our emotions, but it encourages us to become more aware of them and how they affect our actions. It's about learning to pause, to take a deep breath, and to ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now? And is this feeling helping me make a good decision, or is it clouding my judgment?
It's about that self-awareness we talked about before. Recognizing what triggers us, developing strategies to manage our emotions, and creating a space for calm and clear thinking in the middle of all the chaos.
And this is where leadership becomes truly transformational. It's not just about reaching goals, it's about becoming the best versions of ourselves so we can inspire and empower others to do the same.
It's about living out those qualities. Prayer planning, perseverance, and emotional control. Not just checking them off a list, but making them a way of life. A way of leading that's rooted in purpose, integrity, and compassion.
And I think the most inspiring part of the blog post is that it reminds us that this journey is for everyone. We don't have to be some big shot to practice these principles. We can start right where we are right now, by making a conscious decision to lead with more intention, wisdom, and heart.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this question. What's your next step? What's one small thing you can do today to make these principles part of your own leadership style?
Remember, leadership isn't a destination, it's a journey. A journey of constant learning, growth, and self-discovery. And it's a journey worth taking.
We hope you found this conversation insightful and inspiring. Now go out there and lead with courage, wisdom, and heart.